Blog Talk Radio.
The tipping point has been reached. We have more takers than makers, and it's over.
Half of our country, our neighbors, are completely lost in darkness.
Is this just math that you do as a Republican to make yourself feel better?
Ohio really did go to President Obama last night, and he really did win again. And he really was born in Hawaii.
It doesn't matter whether you're black or white or young or old or rich or poor, able, disabled, gay or straight. You can make it here in America.
This is National Progressive Talk Radio, leaving old ways of thinking in the dust. Each Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, we challenge the lies of authority, tradition, superstition, and fear that threaten our future. NPTR, bringing you live progressive talk for a resilient and sustainable world. One planet, one humanity, under reason. Progress is the point. Now, here's your host, Sean Prophet.
Good evening, and thanks for tuning in. Happy 2013 to you. We are back from our holiday break. I hope everyone had a great time with your family, and we here at NPTR are looking forward to an exciting year with many interesting guests. Tonight, our guest is Dr. Cathleen Mann from Denver, Colorado. She is a licensed counselor who has done clinical and forensic work and provided consultations in mental health for 26 years. Originally from Colorado, she received her doctorate in psychology before going on to evaluate hundreds of individuals and families. Dr. Mann has also been court-appointed to assess individuals with mental illness. She is qualified to testify as an expert in 12 states and has been involved in numerous child custody cases. In addition to her contributions in the courtroom, Dr. Mann has conducted state-mandated evaluations for Social Security disability and the vocational rehabilitation process. She is an outspoken critic of the diagnostic process involved in assessing mental health and talks frequently about the role of counseling, evaluation, and outcomes of mental health issues. Dr. Mann, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sean.
Yeah, so a lot of people are suddenly newly interested in the subject of mental illness, and particularly youth mental illness as it relates to, anger or alienation we've seen with many of the recent mass shooters. Now, it's true these shootings are relatively rare, but every time they happen, we Americans seem to understandably spend a lot of time and energy asking ourselves what can be done. So I'd like to start with the most controversial question that's on everyone's mind. Is there any way to figure out in advance who is going to be a mass shooter?
Well, yes and no. I mean, we can identify risk factors. Those are very well documented in the research. But no, we cannot predict how anyone's going to behave regardless of the circumstances. But there are areas that can lead us to a conclusion that violence is going to happen, but as you know, in America, we can't arrest people for a crime unless they've committed one.
Right, then you'd be dealing with that whole pre-crime thing, like
right.
in Minority Report.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and the best way to understand it, I think, is that psychology is very good at looking at things backwards. So if an event happens, like a violent event, psychology is able to look back and point out all the factors that contributed to the act, but it cannot do it forward. It can't predict very well. And so there's a sort of a new fad within psychology called psychological autopsies, where after there's an event, they bring in various psychologists to examine all of the factors, and they identify all of the risk factors that we know cause violence in the first place. So it's kind of a problem.
Yeah. Well, and, aside from predicting it, which doesn't sound like it's going to maybe ever be possible, the next controversial question has to do with cultural influences. And there's three main ones that I always hear about, which are, publicity and people doing things to become famous, and copycat crimes, and then there's violent video games, and then there's this kind of vague idea of a general lack of morals. Can you take those one at a time?
Yes. When we look at the risk factors that have been identified in the research, none of those things are risk factors for violence. They can be adjuncts, or they can be items that feed into the mental health life of a person and maybe make them less mentally healthy, but they're not correlated with the research we have about what causes people to be violent or what are the risk factors for violence. So it's wrong and not correct that video games cause violence. The only time that video games have ever really been an issue, and they blame it also on certain types of music, the only time it's ever been an issue has been afterwards when someone was already predisposed to violence, and these things just perhaps provided some kind of a fantasy. But other than that, I mean, regardless of what video games or heavy metal music or whatever you listen to, if you're not predisposed already, those things aren't going to make much of a contribution. You know, I've listened to Metallica and Iron Maiden and lots of music. Never once did it cause me to want to go out and commit harm to anyone.
Right. Well, you know, and a lot of people have, and, you know, millions of people enjoy video games, and yet, you know, the people I've heard this from say, well, it may not hurt normal people, but it may really, make the difference between, you know, somebody tipping over the edge and going ahead and committing violence. Is there any truth to that?
No, psychology would not support that idea at all. And, you know, video games have different impacts on different people, different ages, different kinds of games. So I just think it's a sort of a ready-made excuse that has no merit.
Yeah, and of course also, you know, you look in other countries and, you know, they all consume the same entertainment and video games that we do, and of course they don't have anywhere near, you know, most of them the level of violence that we do.
Right, that's a good point. Canada doesn't have anywhere, or England or Britain or the United Kingdom does not have anywhere near the violence that we have. And the proliferation of video games is just as strong there as anywhere.
Yeah, and so
we need to let go of the video game theory completely. It needs to be, you know, chucked out the window, and people need to stop using it as an excuse. I guess one of the rationales I use with people about music, when they like to blame certain types of music, is that, you know, if you look at conventional operas or even Shakespearean plays, they're full of violence.
Right.
Operas are full of killing parents and siblings, and they're extremely violent. Deaths, you know, killing yourself with sabers and swords. So that argument just doesn't hold any weight, because we've had violence in music and theater and television, you know, as long as we've been alive on this planet.
Right, and of course, if you listen to Steven Pinker, I mean, his book, you know, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, he talks about how, you know, we're living in actually one of the most peaceful times in world history. And I
have a lot of respect for Steven Pinker. I think that he's a brilliant man, and I really think that he's able to look at the big picture, and instead of taking these little aspects of wanting to censor what information we get in an attempt to make us more docile. I think he's absolutely right about that.
Yeah, and I mean, just one more thing before we get off this topic, and that is that there is an article that was written in Psychology Today, and it talks about a study whereby it was shown that kids had increased levels of aggression. What does that mean? It's obviously being used as a technical term.
Well, aggression means that they are fighting for no reason. It means they're attacking for no reason. So, you know, the best that I can say about Psychology Today is that it has a section where it summarizes research studies. And as far as I know, that is one of the factors that is present in violent behavior, but nobody knows what the source of it is. Nobody knows when it's going to happen, when it's just acting out, or when it's going to become something else. I mean, we can't use it as a factor because we don't know where it comes from, and we don't know how to solve it when it does show up. I mean, I'd be happy to talk a little bit about what we see as risk factors. These are actual risk factors, and by saying that, I mean that these are the things that cause people to be violent if it's in the right quantity and if they have a predisposition to it. Of course, an antisocial behavior of any kind, antisocial behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs. Obviously, substance abuse is a major risk factor. And aggressive behavior is really not that important. Only time it's really of concern is if you see it in a young child, if you see it in someone who's 3 or 4 or 5, and it's aggression that is out of control. If you see that, then that's basically a real problem. If you have any kind of, attention deficit, hyperactivity, or learning disorders, those can be a problem for a number of reasons. People, they just don't process information the same way that we do. Plus, they're subject to taunting and being made to feel different.
Right.
Social problems such as isolation, not being able to have friends or understand the needs of others, or the most important thing is not having empathy. I mean, we learn by the time we're 4 or 5 years old. We go through certain stages to learn empathy, and if we don't have it, we can't get it later on. And so if someone doesn't have empathy, you can't really teach it to them when they're 15 if they don't have it when they're 5.
Right.
So these are some of the areas that are a problem.
Well, and there's this common narrative you hear about, serial killers, that they lack empathy, and, of course, that they begin their criminal career by torturing and killing small animals, and they eventually graduate to human kills. And are you familiar with the show Dexter?
Yes, I'm familiar with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the backstory in that show. Do you think that some people are just born this way, and by the same token, are some people born to be mass shooters?
I don't think I would be that general. I think that there are areas of concern, and like I said, we can look at someone like Ted Bundy and look at his environment and his genetic makeup and his predisposition, and we can go back and say, yes, it was this and this and this. And what was interesting about the Ted Bundy case is that, he was sentenced to die in Florida, and a few months before he died, he decided he was going to tell everybody what caused him to be a serial killer, and he blamed it on pornography, which has been pornography has been shown not to be a risk factor for someone to be a serial killer. So it's interesting that different agendas in our environment are captured by certain interest groups to say, like the NRA, of course, their way of solving the problem is to exacerbate the problem.
Right.
For our religious leaders, it's to be blamed on external sources that are not in keeping with their particular beliefs. So the risk factors also include there's actually 3 areas that we look at when it's risk factors. There's the individual risk factor, which means the personality of the person. What are their personality characteristics, their attitude, their style, their behavior? And this is probably the most important thing, is that how does someone cope? If you don't have good coping skills and you don't have good self-soothing behavior, you're much more at risk than the average person. So there's the individual risk factors. Then there's the family factors. And, of course, we now know in psychology that we can't blame the mother any longer. I mean, we need to blame the family, the siblings, the school, the social events, churches, certainly. These are all equal factors in how a child adapts. But one thing we do know for sure in terms of family and parental involvement is that it's just as harmful to a child to be over-disciplining them as to neglect them. So neglect on one side and abuse on the other side both equally cause cracks in the personality, and the child does not know how to cope and does not know how to control their own emotions.
I would think particularly that would happen like if it was like very sporadic parental attention, and then when they do give them their attention, it's like overly severe discipline, and then they ignore them, and that kind of back and forth.
Yes, inconsistent discipline is the worst kind. It's the actual worst kind of discipline you can use on a child at any time. So if you ignore them, or you're real abusive and then you're real nice and you're real kind and whatever, it's a recipe for disaster. So that's the worst kind of discipline. Also, if there's a lot of conflict and violence in the home, so if they grow up and they see violence and they see that violence is used to solve problems, that's what they're going to learn. Now, I'm not going to say that every home that has that means that the child is going to react that way, but again, these are risk factors. It reminds me of every day when I read the paper, I see that another football player has been arrested for domestic violence, and
right.
there's a reason for that. It's because they've learned to solve problems through aggression, and so they don't understand any other way to get people to do what they want, and they don't have any other coping skills. And another one you brought up that's real important, if there's a low emotional attachment to one of the parents, it's an absent parent, or it's a parent that just, for whatever reason, doesn't have the ability to bring nurturing, that's a risk factor. The third area is the risk factors for violence at school. Obviously, gang involvement is a major factor. Not that everybody in a gang is violent, but it is a culture of violence.
What's interesting, though, is that I'm sorry. What's interesting to me is that all of these mass shooters are loners, not members of gangs. It's like the gangs keep their violence away because they want to do business, and it's these loners and these who seem to have mental illness more of a factor than gangs.
I would agree with you that at least the 3 school shootings that I can think of, the one here in Columbine, which was very close to where I live, it is a myth that they were loners. I mean, it is a myth that they were bullied, when in reality they were bullying. They weren't really bullied, but they were outsiders, and they were loners among themselves. They did have their group of friends, but they weren't loners in the sense that they didn't have any contact or anything to do or anybody to connect with. But you did bring up rejection by those at schools or victims of bullying, and bullying is a very hot topic right now in psychology, trying to teach kids how not to bully and give them consequences for bullying. And I think that's fine as long as they understand that bullying doesn't stop just because you left school, that bullying is a part of life. So, if you go out in the work world or you get involved in relationships or friendship, bullying is everywhere.
General hazing, it's like just people trying to establish dominance in various groups.
Yeah, and so it's part of human nature, and so it's not going to go away just because you can control it in school. I'm not saying that it's not a good start. It's just, again, people putting all of the answers into one solution, and it's just, not going to happen. And I think what bothers me the most is whenever an event happens that people say, well, if they had mental health treatment, or if they had counseling, or if the whole family had been in counseling. I mean, that's very frustrating for me to hear.
Yeah.
Because
sure.
it's just not true. I mean, mental health treatment cannot solve social problems. But more importantly, the mental health treatment that's out there is extremely complicated. And, when they just want to throw it all, it's kind of like when people get sentenced in court and they're court ordered to go to therapy. I mean, it just is a recipe for disaster, because most of the time the people that are on the front lines doing the counseling, actual counselors who are doing nothing else, are extremely low paid. It's a very stressful job, and it's a hard way to make a living. The only way that you can really make any money in counseling or psychology is if you supervise or teach or do everything else but actually do counseling. So that's the first problem, and it's easy to get very burned out. And the second, most people don't get better in counseling, regardless of how good the counselor may be or how ideal the setting is. Most people stay the same or get worse. I mean, there are actually studies that are done that talk about people that get worse in counseling, and we need to pay attention to that.
So are you kind of saying, is that sort of like a blanket indictment of psychotherapy in general, or that's kind of shocking statement, actually?
Well, I think that counseling can be beneficial if it's done in a certain way, if it's done in more of an educational format and more geared towards coping skills. But the problem with counseling is not just with the counselor, but it's with the perception of counseling. People think that counseling is going to be like it is on television. And, in reality, we do have characteristics of people that are good candidates for counseling, and I get a lot of calls with people saying, I want to put so-and-so into counseling, and I'm like, well, these are the factors that will decide whether or not they'll be successful. But the other issue is that most people really don't want to get better in counseling. What they really want is for their environment to change. They want their circumstances to change. They want other people to change. They really don't want to change themselves. And a bigger problem in terms of kids that may be problematic, adolescents. I do a lot of work with children, a lot of work with adolescents, and often I can work on the child and make the child better, but then I put them right back into the system that they came from. And if you don't change the whole system, it's just not going to stick.
So what you're kind of saying is that counseling and therapy is sort of a bit of a Band-Aid, and that really we just need to have some real, like, what do the kids need? Do they need more attention? Do they need better education? Like, what would we do?
Well, in terms of mental health, I think that it's a very complicated problem. Like I said, it's to be a counselor is very stressful. It's very low paying. If you work in a setting where it's adolescents, like a detention facility or a group home for adolescents, it's the therapy that they get is completely behavioral. There's no discussion about long-term discussion because they just don't have time. They don't have the staff. And again, the characteristics that make someone get better in counseling are that they have good insight, that they're at least average intelligence, and that their motivation for change is internal. So if you don't have all three of those elements, counseling will fail.
Right. Well, I'd like to talk, people throw around the terms a lot, sociopath, psychopath, and I'm just wondering, are these mass shooters either psychopaths or sociopaths or both? Like, what's the difference? I'm not really clear on that.
Yeah, these are terms that have really been abandoned in favor of more euphemistic terms like antisocial personality, but the reality of it is that there are sociopaths and there are psychopaths. And the difference between a sociopath and a psychopath is that a psychopath is usually someone that has naked aggression that cannot be controlled. Someone like Dexter is much more of a psychopath than a sociopath. Mm-hmm. They act out aggressively. They have difficulty in relationships. They have difficulty controlling themselves. So there is a fine line. Now, sociopath is someone who's much more subtle, and usually sociopaths are very high achieving, and it usually goes hand in hand with narcissism. And so there are a lot of people that are in offices of high importance and people that are very powerful that are probably sociopathic. So sociopaths tend to treat people as objects. They gravitate towards power. They're not really very aware of the feelings of others. They don't really understand how they affect other people by their behavior. But at the same time, their behavior is not destructive enough that it would cross into criminal behavior, and that's usually the difference. There are different kinds of sociopaths, and sometimes they're created by the situation that they're in, as opposed to being born that way. I don't really think that we have enough information, enough research to say that sociopaths or psychopaths are born that way. I think it's probably a combination of many different things that cause people to become sociopathic or psychopathic. The problem with psychopaths is that they usually end up in prison, and so they're not usually out there affecting the community, whereas sociopaths are much better at blending in and not committing crimes, and so they can operate for a long time.
Right. Well, that's very interesting. And I'm wondering also what the psychological differences are between the sort of methodical serial killers who get away with it for years, and then the mass shooters who tend to go out all at once in what they must see as a blaze of twisted glory or something.
Well, I think that in this most recent case, we really don't know what the circumstances are. We just know what we heard, but you can take one look at a picture of the Sandy shooter and realize that there's something seriously wrong there. He has just a very flat affect and no emotion, no expression. That's something that had been cultured in him for a long time. And that's why I think I have problems with the word snapped. People don't really snap. What they do is they stuff things down, stuff, and then they explode. So, we can go back and look at the factors. He was socially isolated. He, didn't have any awareness of any other reality outside of the reality of his own home, and he had access to guns. And I do think that, back to the issue of guns, the fact of the matter is if you have access to guns, you're certainly going to be able to be more violent than if you don't. So
right.
The fact that we have so many guns in this society is a problem. It's a huge, big part of why we have violence.
Right, and I would definitely want to talk more about guns in the second half, but right while we're on the topic of the family, I know it would be speculation at this point on your part, but what if you had to speculate? What would you say, other than what you've already said, might have played a role in his specific case? Well,
he obviously had some kind of disability, perhaps. Perhaps he was autistic. That's what they're saying. Autism is not a mental illness, but it does inhibit your ability to communicate. Most autistic children and young adults, they're very frustrated. They don't know how to communicate. They don't know how to express what's going on with them. So if he did have autism, I think that there are ways that can be treated. There are specific ways that you can help autistic children be more functional, but you shouldn't leave them at home and allow them access to guns and let them have very little interaction of any kind of a normal way. So I guess that's my big concern, is the fact that I don't know if it's true, but I read an article from a pretty reliable source that the mother was a doomsday prepper, had a huge store of food and supplies and a fallout shelter, right, and was teaching the child that the end of the world was coming at any moment. And that's pretty dangerous. If the person doesn't have the ability to cope and has no way to check the reality out. And I think with this kid, there was no way for him to check out anybody else's reality but his own.
Well, yeah.
So those are the things that concern me.
Right, and if you're prepping for doomsday, and if you're somebody who also, not all doomsday preppers are going to be like this, but someone who is a little bit on the edge mentally, might figure, well, if it's all going to end anyway, why not go out this way, right?
Right, and it's hard to know. It's hard to know what the issue was that caused him to spill over. It's hard to know if it was just an accumulation of things over time, but it could be anything. But I think that people saying, well, if he had been in mental health counseling, none of this would have happened. Well, that's not true because, like I said, most people don't get better in counseling. And they were saying he should be medicated. Well, there's no medication for autism or no medication for a neurological disorder like that, and if he was depressed, maybe that could have been evaluated, but it just seems to me that it's instructive to me that the first person he shot was his mother, which probably means that he was the most afraid of her. It's all speculation, but what I don't like to see is people say, well, let's put all these kids into detention, or let's put all these kids into group homes. First of all, there's no room, and two, there's no money, and even if there were, all they do is teach them behavioral skills. There's no processing, there's no coping. It's just strictly behavioral because that's all we really have the money to do. Right. When I work with adolescents in counseling, I insist that the entire family participate because I'm not going to just work with the adolescent and then expect them to be okay and everybody else. So if the family's not willing to come in and work together as a family, then I don't see adolescents in isolation.
Right. Well, we have to take a brief break now. I'm speaking with Dr. Cathleen Mann, a licensed counselor from Denver, Colorado. She has done clinical and forensic work and provided consultations in mental health for 26 years. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
You're listening to National Progressive Talk Radio with Sean Prophet, leaving old ways of thinking in the dust. Tune in Sundays at 9 p.m. Eastern for more all-new, live, progressive talk. Stream any episode on demand from www.nptr.net or download podcasts from iTunes to listen on the go. Like us on Facebook for show updates and information.
And welcome to the second half of our show on the psychology of violence with Dr. Cathleen Mann. Dr. Mann is court appointed to assess individuals with mental illness. She is qualified to testify as an expert in 12 states. In this half, I'm going to be calling on her expertise to suggest some possible solutions to America's violence problem from a mental health perspective. Dr. Mann, welcome back to the show. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Sean.
You're welcome. So what do you think is the single most important thing we could do as a nation to solve this problem of gun violence in general and mass shootings specifically?
Well, I look at the problem very much like the war on drugs. There are guns everywhere, and there are people with guns everywhere, just like there are people with drugs everywhere. Drugs are readily accessible to anyone, same thing with drugs. And so all of our laws and banning and et cetera are not going to have any real effect on the guns in this country. So I look at it from kind of like a violence perspective. And there's three main ways to deal with the problem. The first way would be to use consequence interventions. That's like removal of weapons when someone is arrested for something else. So like if someone is arrested for a domestic disturbance or an alcohol-related offense or a drug-related offense, to remove the weapons. I mean, some of that already is happening. Increasing penalties for weapons being used in any kind of other crime. And this is all, again, supposedly taking away weapons from the people that are using them inappropriately. So that's one solution, and, we can guess at how well that's going to work. I mean, it's going to be limited. A second attempt would be the minimization of damage approach, where we have restrictions on ownership through licensure. And I think you had brought this up one time in a discussion, and I agree with it, requiring people to get liability insurance if they have a gun of any kind. And they have to have it kind of like with a car, which can be a lethal weapon. They need to have liability insurance for each one of the firearms that they own. Increasing security personnel, of course, that's always a solution, but it's not really a solution, because with the airports, I mean, the airports have the level of security at airports has become ridiculous, and it's all based on fear that somebody's going to get through and then somebody's going to get blamed. So the motivation is with security is people are afraid that something's going to happen and that they're going to lose their job. Then in terms of guns control, they're talking about this now, elimination of certain types of weapons, limitations on the amount of ammunition that can be purchased. I know in the Aurora shooting that he was able to have a huge stockpile of weapons that he was able to order online.
Right, and he got a 100-round magazine, which fortunately jammed, and a lot of people in that theater owe their lives to the fact that his magazine jammed,
Right, and there's not really very good understanding or control on. I don't think that I really understand how you can get that kind of a weaponry just over the internet. I don't understand how someone can't be tracked or can be checked. I guess you can use fake names, but there have been circumstances in the past, as you know, where someone has used a fake ID to purchase weapons.
Right.
Gone over the state line, and they got in trouble for using a fake ID. So I'm not really sure how that can happen.
Well, it seems to me that all of these things. I mean, I'm not an expert on gun policy, but it seems like we could enforce the existing laws better, and there may be new laws that we need to come up with. I mean, this is endlessly debated, of course, and the gun rights people are very, very, very unwilling to cooperate in any way of doing really anything to make it harder to get guns, and that's the part that bothers me.
Yeah, certain kinds of weapons should not be allowed. Certain kinds of, some kind of limitation on the ammunition. The Brady bill has been largely ineffectual because it basically, as his premise, has this idea that you have to wait a certain amount of time between picking out a gun and actually purchasing it. This whole rage theory, right? That people go into a gun shop with rage, and if we can just wait, then their rage will be over. Well, obviously that doesn't work, and not only that, so many guns are purchased illegally. Right. I'm not really sure how we can control that. I sort of have a theory that I've mentioned, which of course is not very realistic, is instead of regulating guns, let's regulate ammunition.
Yeah.
To me, that would be, a bigger solution.
Well, it's part of the same problem. You have to have both of them. So I mean, I guess you could regulate ammunition, but it's pretty easy to make ammunition.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Now the third possible solution is the prevention activities, which are what people have been promoting for years and years and years. Requiring gun safety courses, teaching nonviolent solving problems, coping skills in prison. Mm-hmm. And I've taught anger control to offend anger management, and it's just not effective. It just goes completely against the entire way that they are taught to be respectful of themselves and others. So it just goes nowhere. I mean, the anger management techniques tend to not work because they're really kind of ridiculous, and most people are not going to remember how to assess their anger before it becomes anger.
Right, because it's
also,
by the very nature. It seems like it's almost like, drinking. Once you start getting drunk, your judgment about how much you can still drink goes away. And so once you start getting angry, your judgment about your, not being angry goes away.
And one of the techniques we use in anger management when we teach it to people is for them to pay more attention to their feelings and to understand that anger just doesn't happen, that there are steps they take before they get angry. First they get annoyed and irritated, and then they start to become more aggressive, and then they have an angry outburst. And you teach people to become more aware of their feelings about that. And that's all fine and good, but it's just not very practical.
Right.
In terms of prevention activities, there are, one of the biggest things is, again, I disagree with this, but there's taxing violence-stimulating public offerings in films, and they've tried this before. It's similar to a parental label on so-called obscene music. It doesn't prevent anyone who wants to listen from getting what they need to get. And I just don't believe in the United States that you have the right to tell people what they can and cannot watch if you're a grown-up person.
Right, sure, and you said in our first tip, that you didn't think that was really a risk factor anyway.
No, it isn't. But I mean, the music and the video games and the movies. I mean, as adults, we should be able, within reason, to see whatever we want to see, without any kind of nobody should be able to tell me what movie I can watch unless I'm breaking some existing law.
Right. Unless it's like a a film of someone actually breaking the law, like a snuff film or child pornography or things like that.
Exactly. So if I'm not breaking the law and it's just a regular violent movie that's not breaking the law, then I don't think that anyone has the right to tell me that because it's risky that I'm not allowed to see it. So I understand the outrage. In terms of psychology, though,
it presents a real dilemma. No, that's okay. Well, for people on the right, who are generally very libertarian and they want, they're for freedom, so they want to have people free to own guns. But then if they start talking about regulating films, then, they've just become hypocrites.
Yeah, and it won't work anyway because it just creates an underground and it doesn't solve the problem at all. In terms of psychology, I mean, one of the things that I would suggest and have suggested, and I'm certainly not the only one that's done this, is to give better education to those on the front lines who are actually seeing clients about what your options are when it comes to violence, because we're not really allowed to call the police or place somebody on a hold just because we think they might be violent. There are very strict rules. For example, if someone is imminently, which means right now, violent, and they have a plan and they have a name and they have a weapon, theoretically you can place them on a mental health hold and have them evaluated, but they go to the emergency room, and as soon as they tell the doctor they're not going to do it anymore, they let them go. And part of that is because it's expensive to keep somebody there, and
right.
Two, they can't keep people against their will unless they meet the criteria in the law that says they're imminently harmful.
Right, and
the other thing is that there's been my 26 years of counseling experience, evaluation experience. There's been 3 times when I've had to use a mental health hold, and it's so rare that you usually cannot find anyone that meets the criteria. And even if they do, there's no counseling or treatment available for them, and they're not going to cooperate if they're placed somewhere, and there's no money to pay for it anyway. I mean, to me, there's just, in terms of mental health, if you have insurance, it will pay for some things, but not everything, and it's certainly not going to pay for you to be inpatient or in a holding facility of any kind.
Well, there was a story that I saw about this, and it was about someone who, didn't really have the means and was almost contemplating, getting their son charged with some sort of crime in order so they could get into a criminal mental health program or something because she couldn't afford to pay. There was that article. It was that article. I am so and so's mother. You remember that?
Adam Lonzo's mother.
Yeah.
That was the article you're talking about.
Yeah, I wasn't.
Yeah, and that sounds really good. It sounds like that's really a problem. But again, even if the best case scenario were to happen and she were to get her minor child, not an adult child, into some kind of center or detention center, the only kind of counseling they get is behavioral.
Mm-hmm.
They don't get any direct it's basically a point system where they learn to conform their behavior to what the adults tell them to do. Now, if you're an antisocial personality anyway, and you tend to see through this as manipulation, you're going to go along. For as long as you go along, you're going to get out and do what you want. So it's not really realistic. I think that when I give advice to parents, I tell them that the best things they can do for their child is to be consistent and to discipline them while they're still cute. If they wait until they're 12 or 13 to start disciplining them, they're in for trouble, and that's what a lot of parents do.
Right. No, for sure. I mean, but what if someone notices a young person acting creepy? There's untold thousands of kids who act creepy, and yet they pose a threat to no one. So, what's the best course of action to let authorities know without it turning into further stigmatization of a kid who just really needs help?
Well, if they're in school, it's the job of the school counselor to make these kind of assessments. If you're a teacher, you work within the school system, you're mandatory reporters if you see any kind of weird behavior going on. All licensed mental health professionals are mandatory reporters. When I see creepy or weird or dangerous behavior, I'm required to report it. It doesn't happen very often. But you can call the police. But, frankly, the police are not going to care. They're not going to care unless there's something has happened. They're not going to care. No. They're not going to care because something might happen. I mean, just think about it from your own state of mind. I mean, I'm sure that there have been times when you've been angry in a public place. And I know I've been angry in airports a few times, but I've just learned not to do anything or say anything because someone could call the authorities on you. And so you have to be able to control your behavior in certain circumstances. And so in schools, if they're engaged in schools, there are programs and things that they can take advantage of. School counselors are usually overworked and are just trying to put out fires all the time. So in terms of psychology, though, if I were to recommend anything, I mean, there's been a major study called the MacArthur Violence Risk Assessment, and it talks a lot about the problems with violence, the problems with risk assessment, the factors that go into people being violent. One thing I might not have talked about, but violent fantasies. And sometimes people can have violent fantasies, and that's fine, but when they act on those violent fantasies, that's when it becomes a problem. And so,
is there a way to tell when somebody's having? I mean, do people usually report their violent fantasies? Do you hear about it from their friends, or what's the procedure?
Usually, what happens is they write about it. It happened with the two Columbine kids, the two shooters. They wrote about it in class. They wrote an essay about. One of them wrote an essay about Hitler, their admiration for Hitler, and another one wrote an essay about wanting to blow up the school. So the parents were called in, and the principal, and they said, "Oh, we were just playing around." And 2 weeks later, they acted on their fantasy. So it's hard to say. I mean, I think schools take as much precaution as they possibly can, but you never know if someone's really going to do it or they're just fantasizing. It's a good question.
Right. Well,
we can't arrest people for their thoughts.
No, that's that whole pre-crime thing again. Well, so we've talked about that, mental health counseling doesn't really work at least with the current levels of funding, and we kind of agree that it's a real issue in terms of how to regulate guns. So the National Rifle Association has come along and said, well, let's just arm the teachers. What do you think about that?
I think it's a terrible idea. I mean, we had armed guards at Columbine before the Columbine school shooting ever happened. And if I were a teacher, I mean, I'm like a lot of people. I don't want anything to do with a gun. If I was a teacher, I would think that was a terrible idea. I don't really know what the solution is. I just know that there's not one solution. And to blame mental health and to blame psychology or whatever for the problem is unrealistic and just not really fair. I had mentioned earlier that we do have research that sociopathic personalities and people who are psychopathic actually get worse in counseling. They get worse in therapy. And so it's kind of a problem when you are throwing counseling or therapy at someone and this person has a sociopathic tendency, when the research is telling us that they get worse.
So what do you do? I mean, it just sounds like there's really almost nothing you can do.
Well, I think you can try. It's like with anything else. It's like the war on drugs. I mean, you can try, and I think that you can do what you can.
Right. With the war on drugs, though, I mean, to be fair, it seems like that, the strategy that's working is not trying. I mean, the strategy that's working is legalization.
Yeah. Well, we've got hundreds of thousands of people in prison for drug-related crimes that were not violent.
Right.
And so I think I don't mean to be completely pessimistic. I think that we can try, but to say it's just one thing, just to improve one thing, is going to leave people eternally frustrated. With counseling, I mean, it's a frustrating profession.
Mm-hmm.
And so you work with people who really want you to fix everybody else. And as soon as you focus in on them or their problems, and they're gone, they don't want to come back. And so you can try and you can be there and you can offer the service, but if people aren't willing to use it as it's intended, there's not a lot you can do just to be there and offer it. I mean,
So maybe try to figure out who these people are and, arrest them, put them into, mental health. I mean, I don't know. I mean, this is the...
Well, first of all, we can't arrest people for being mentally ill. If they're mentally ill and they're not gravely disabled and they're not harmful to themselves or others, they can be as mentally ill as they want to be.
Right.
And most mentally ill people, especially men, wind up in prison anyway. So that's probably the best mental health treatment they're going to get. It's strictly behavioral. But in terms of mental illness, I think that it's hard. It's kind of complicated and hard to explain, but it's really hard when you see people come in for counseling who have so many other problems. They have a substance abuse problem. They have job-related problems, financial, all of these other things that contribute to their mental illness. And so the best you can do is teach them how to cope, because we can't change environmental factors. We can't change what other people do.
Well, what about the guns themselves? Okay, I mean, I think we don't really have time to cover the actual issue of gun control on this show, but I just wanted to ask you, in terms of psychology, how does the object of the gun and the gun culture change a person's psychology when there's a lot of guns around?
I think so. I mean, I think that it's been well established within the social psychological research that circumstances or our setting, our environment can change you as a person. So if you enter into an environment where there's a gun culture or general acceptance of guns, I think that over time you have to accept that or you have to leave, called cognitive dissonance. I mean, you can't just stay in a setting for very long unless you adapt to that setting. I don't necessarily think that guns themselves are the problem. I think that they're a symptom of a society that is very broken and lots of different issues. And I think that people, whenever we have an event of any kind, they always say, well, this person needs some therapy. Well, therapy isn't guaranteed to work. In fact, the outcomes are very poor. The outcomes for conventional therapy are worse than spontaneous recovery. So spontaneous recovery, meaning you get better on your own, is about 50%. The outcomes for psychology or counseling of any kind or interventions are in the 30s.
Wow.
Most people get better on their own through other means, usually through corrective relationships, corrective emotional relationships, by getting themselves in a good structure, a good structured job, these kinds of things. Or they go to prison. If they go to prison, then they're going to get their mental health treatment there.
Yeah, well, we're getting really close to the end, but I have one more question I wanted to ask, and that is about Canada, because, Canada has a lot lower rate of gun crime, firearms-related deaths than we do, and yet Canadians have just about the same number of weapons per capita that we do. And what do you think about that?
Well, I've heard that. I've been to Canada a few times. It's a completely different culture. Even though it's right across the border, there's all kinds of differences that are very apparent. And I'm not really sure what the answer to that is. I know that there is a different set of values and principles, I think, in Canada than there are here. I mean, Americans, frankly, are very selfish, and they think we're special, and there's just this sort of attitude of the individual maverick taking on the system attitude that's so prevalent in our culture. When you go to Canada, it doesn't seem like that's quite the same attitude, but I don't really know if that's the difference or if it's just that it's the same thing with United Kingdom or in England. They have 600 shootings a year or something, and it's not that people can't get guns. It's just that the entire culture is different, and so that's a very good question. But I think that whenever we have an event like this, you said something earlier about copycats. I mean, the thing gets played so often, and so it's everywhere you look. And
so do you think that's a risk factor?
I do. It's dissected to minutia. I think it's a risk factor. I think that there are copycats. I think there are people that enjoy that kind of notoriety, and I think it's a problem that not only are we media saturated, but that it's so skewed, and we're not really told the truth. We're told little bits of things, and I think that's a problem. But there's all kinds of problems, and the experts on violence don't have any solutions.
Right. Well, I hate to end it there, but we need to because our hour is up. What if are any resources that you can recommend for people who want to try to do something about this or become more educated?
Yes, I recommend to review the MacArthur Violence Risk Assessment. You can just find it online at www.macarthur.virginia.edu. It's a major funded. Goes into all the things that don't work, all the things that we should avoid. It talks a lot about the risk factors and what we can do to take care of each individual risk factor. And it's a government-funded study.
Very good. Well, I look forward to reading that. Dr. Mann, thank you for being with us. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Sean. I appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. Well, that is it for our show this evening. Tune in next Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific, when I will be interviewing Dr. Christopher Ryan, co-author of the evolutionary psychology classic Sex at Dawn. Until then, stay progressive, stay active, and good night.
This has been a production of National Progressive Talk Radio with Sean Prophet, leaving old ways of thinking in the dust. Tune in Sundays at 9 p.m. Eastern for more all-new live progressive talk. Stream any episode on demand from www.nptr.net or download podcasts from iTunes to listen on the go. And be sure to write down our call-in number, 347-326-9690, 347-326-9690. Like us on Facebook for show updates and information. This program is a production of NPTR, which is solely responsible for its content, and is copyleft under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike license. NPTR, where progress is the point. Theme music, copyright 5 Alarm Music, all rights reserved.
Tonight, the task of perfecting our union moves forward. It moves forward because of you. It moves forward because you reaffirmed the spirit that has triumphed over war and depression, the belief that while each of us will pursue our own individual dreams, we are an American family and we rise